Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Christian Hecker, also known as Tiger. That's Tigaer. That's the name. You can usually find me on sites like DeviantArt, ArtStation, CG Society, and so on. So, what we are going to do here is to talk about this little picture we see here in front of us. That's the picture called Valis Licentia. Don't ask me what this name basically means. I actually have no big idea. I just thought it sounds cool. Anyway, let's talk about this little picture. So what we are going to do here is to take a look how this picture came together. That includes the 3D stage and the Photoshop stage where it all comes together. Since this picture is basically a mixed media creation with created with several tools, but mainly it's Eon Software's View and Adobe Photoshop that brought this world to life. And the reason why I did go for a walkthrough is rather simple. I got a lot of requests over the past couple of years regarding creating a tutorial about how I create my pictures. And some requests came from users on DeviantArt or from all these sites or email. And some requests came from magazines like Advanced Photoshop. But the fact that it's a rather complicated technique that goes back and forth between View and Photoshop, because I tend to render a lot of elements not right then and there when I decide to do the first final render. No, a lot of stuff comes together while working on the image, so it's very, very hard to plan how to fluidly explain the process of it all, since, like I said, everything comes together while working on the image itself. So a tutorial would be a rather complicated thing to create, so like I said, a walkthrough is something I had in mind for a while now and decided to try it out now. So the reason to go with this picture is actually rather simple. It's one of my more successful pictures. It got featured in Ballistic Publishing's Expose books, or at least one book. That's a great honor for me amongst all these industry professionals. And the fact that this image managed to be fairly successful on art websites like DeviantArt, it got a great view count, and that's, I thought, a good base to start from. And probably a lot of people may be interested in how this picture comes together or came together. And so we are going to have a look into View, how the scene is set up within View, and how the file setup looks with all the objects and how it's all set up there. And from there we go into Photoshop and look at how the different rendered elements came together, and what element was rendered first, what came later in the process, and how it all came to this final result that we can see here now, with all the detail and the depth and its flaws that are certainly there. We will talk about all that, and I hope you find this interesting, at least a little bit, and maybe you learn something that will help you with your own creative process and take you to a new level. And much like this picture helped me to learn a lot of stuff. So let's quit the talking here and move right into View, and let's have a look how the scene looks in there. Alright, now we're on view, and on the right you can see the layers tab, where you can see all the folders with all the objects in it. And I must say, this seeing this scene in view is a little bit of time travel for me, going back to this old project, looking at how I did it, and discovering stuff, rediscovering stuff, and it's kind of fascinating from my point of view. But anyway, as you can see, Vue looks kind of like every other 3D package out there. You have your 4 windows with the perspectives and all the other stuff. Well, on the contrary, it may be a little easier to navigate, and the overall setup of the software is a little less confusing than, let's say, in Maya or 3ds Max. To explain a little bit, this over here is normally the preview render, a very small preview render area. I usually tend to deactivate this area. That's why I reduced this part to the minimum to keep all the other tabs as big as possible, so the setup works best with my workflow. But anyway, let's go into the world browser that contains all the layers. The layers normally or usually are nothing else than folders that contain the objects. And layer 1 usually contains the camera, the sun, clouds, and all the basic elements of the scene. So let's close this one. Let's go into layer 2. Layer 2 has an object in it that I tried to play with very, very early on when I started creating this scene. It was really just an experiment, but let's have a look at what it actually is and do a quick test render for this one. So I quickly skipped the test rendering. So what we see here is a preview render with that experimental object. Here I have to say that the picture was created in 2010, where I didn't do much stuff with volumetric lighting and light objects, etc. So this was really a big experiment, and as you can see, it doesn't look too convincing. It just doesn't work. So I left it and tried other stuff, and that stuff led into the picture we know with the final result. Nonetheless, I kept this experiment in here. That's something I do for some reason. Experiments within scenes, I tend to keep them in the file just to go back to them at some point, even if I don't. It's good to have it in the backend if a new idea comes up and I want to play with it. The next layer is our hero terrain. Now, this hero terrain is interesting since today I would plant all my ecosystem details, which are here in a separate layer. Nowadays I would plant all the forests and the stuff on the terrain directly, while back then I painted it by hand. And well, there are situations when painting by hand surely is helpful, especially when it comes to very specific detail. Nowadays, I would plant the forests directly on the terrain, which is a little quicker, of course, and in some cases even looks more natural because you have certain options and things that help you to define where the forest appears and how strong, etc., etc. And layer terrain 2 contains an additional terrain that actually got placed there rather late in the process, since originally I worked with only my hero terrain in the terrain 1 folder. But later in the process I noticed that there's something missing composition-wise on the left side of the image. And well, let's have a look and render this scene without the terrain element on the left, just to have a look at what's actually missing. And as you can see, the whole composition setup with the lines and how the picture flows just doesn't really work. So let's skip this one, since we already see that it doesn't work. So let's do another test render with the activated terrain, and we immediately see that the lines flow much better and lead you to what eventually become the area where the hero building will be. And so this adding this terrain late in the process made the pig work much better, and surely, well, helped the overall scene to leave a much better impression and help to help the viewer to read the image much better. So this is the terrain 2 folder, and now we come to the most important part of the overall image, and that's the hero buildings. And we have one big one there that is super detailed and contains, as you can see, a lot of objects and extra groups and folders, and I don't know, it's really crazy. I thrown everything in there that I have just to give it a convincing detail. And to explain the buildings, I have to open up a separate file, since this file here would be too heavy to handle for view, and the separate recording that runs in the background. So let's skip this one and go right into the file with the building. Alright, so now we are in the view file that contains the building elements, and that's something I regularly do when working on larger scenes that contain a lot of very high detail objects. I tend to work out the hero objects in separate scene files, so the main scene file doesn't get overloaded, and it's much more quicker to work on the details in separate files, since of course the computer isn't overloaded with data and the RAM is not so filled with stuff that you actually don't work on. So it's much more efficient to start separate files. Another thing I can tell you is this weird object that's sticking out here in the area is, I don't know, a weird error I discovered while working on this scene in 2010, and for some reason it carried over into the 2015 version. But it's I don't know what exactly it is, but it has something to do with an object that's built inside the hero building, and if I delete that object from the hero building, this big artifact here will disappear as well. But it's no big issue, since the big object only appears in the preview windows and not in the render. So, well, it's fairly easy to ignore it, and it doesn't hurt, except the feeling that's something very off. Anyway, as you can see in the world browser, I deleted a lot of stuff to keep this scene as smooth as possible, so I can go a little closer to the hero building without losing too much performance. Alright, let's go a little closer. And as you can see, it's still very, very slow. But let's do a little circle move so we can see it from different perspectives. It is a very complex object, and I must admit that I'm not the most amazing 3D modeling artist. So what I usually do is I think what's called kit bashing. That's basically taking objects you already have, may it be bought objects or objects you found free on the internet, and or objects you built yourself, and basically using these to create new stuff and bringing in a lot of what's called visual noise. That's basically a lot of very fine detail that suggests that a lot of stuff is going on the surface of that building. Let's try a test render and have a look at what it looks like from this perspective. Alright, again I skipped the render process. I'm sure you don't mind. You can see here on the right is probably the object that mirrors up here for some reason, and if I delete this part down here, the big shadow object here will disappear as well. But anyway, as you can see, there is a lot of detail going on. I've thrown a lot of stuff in there, and maybe you even recognize some stuff from other projects I did over the time. What we have here are a lot of objects from the dystopia city blocks that you can find online, and I took these apart and in Cinema 4D and created separate smaller objects from the buildings that are included in that pack, and that's how I brought in all these small details you can see here. Of course, that's far from efficient working, since the polygon count is astronomical, but it's quick. It helps you to create a convincing detail level, even for scene elements that are actually in the background, more in the background. But anyway, let's have a look from another perspective, and let's circle this one a little more. It is very, very complex and far away from smooth, as you can see. Alright, let's take this perspective and do another render that I'll skip. Alright, here we have another one, and it looks actually pretty cool, to be honest. These black values here look really, really nice, as well as the lighting from the back and the shadow play here in the terrain area. A good way to avoid view reacting very slowly is, for example, to deactivate several of these objects. So the preview, of course, will be much faster, and you will be able to move through the scene much more efficient. And that's something I regularly do, since of course I want to get stuff done as fast as possible, and that's of course a reason why these layers here in the world browser will help you to control your scene much more efficiently, since when view starts to react very poorly, you can deactivate these layers and it will eventually start to be much more quicker in its reaction, as we already can see here. It is much more comfortable to work with. Okay, let's do another quickie test render from this perspective, so you have another perspective from this object. Alright, this one looks pretty cool too. There could be some quickie concept art stuff done with this preview. Well, anyway, here we have another preview of the building, and well, I think we covered that ground rather nicely. So let's go back to the big scene and have a look at the remaining layers that are in the actual big project file. Alright, now we are back in the big scene file, and one more thing regarding the performance in Vue. Sometimes it's necessary to switch to wireframe mode just to look at specific details sometimes. The wireframe mode, especially when complex objects like the hero building we have in our scene or in this scene, can slow down dramatically the overall performance of Vue. So keep in mind that switching back to flat shaded often works wonders in the reaction time from within Vue when working on heavy scenes. That as a side note. Alright, we are back in the big scene. We have here, of course, the hero building we just talked about. It's deactivated for performance reasons. And then we have basically a copy of the hero building as the background building that's placed on the mountain hang here in the back. And its purpose is basically to serve as a object composition wise and for depth reasons, just to have something more complex in the background as well, not just the mountain. Let's deactivate this one again, since again performance. Next layer is the ecosystem layer, and as I said in earlier, this contains the global ecosystem element that practically represents the forest we have in the scene. And as you can see, there is a lot of stuff going on. It's basically all hand painted in case of this scene, and it's very memory intensive. It's a very memory intensive procedure with these forests, especially when it later goes into rendering in print size, like 5,000 or 6,000 pixels wide. This can have a great impact on your RAM, and when multipass options are activated, this can eat a lot of memory. Of course, thinking back to the computer I had in 2010, which was a PC with 12 gigabyte RAM and a i7 Intel 920 with, I think, 2.8 gigahertz. Still a pretty good machine in my point of view, but since then I upgraded to a 32 gigabyte RAM machine, and this working with 32 gigabyte RAM is of course much more comfortable than with 12, especially when it later comes into rendering the scene in very large pixel resolution. So yeah, basically every dot you can see in the top view over here represents one object that's planted there, and that's quite a number, to be honest. And I'm surprised how well it worked, and the overall quality of the forest in the scene looked very, very good, at least in my eyes. A lot of nice variation in size in the trees and the coverage. And yeah, I was fairly happy with the result of this forest since I started this project actually as a pure nature scene. There wasn't actually intended to be a sci-fi element in this scene. The first ideas I had was more a fantasy approach with I don't know, a castle or a fortress in it. But well, the sci-fi fan that I am, of course, the sci-fi elements took over, and I started to work more with a sci-fi setup. Even though you could say that the hero building or the buildings I added in this scene for the final image kind of look like a dark fortress kind of thing, and yeah, I mentioned the experimental artifact kind of thing that I showed you earlier. The fortress idea actually came even before that, but well, it's I don't know. I got sidetracked and it all turned into sci-fi, like with so many other projects. I started with the idea of a fantasy scene since I definitely need a little more experience with fantasy. But well, sci-fi is my thing, and that's something I feel comfortable with. And even though every artist will say you or will tell you that hey, you have to work out of your comfort zone, and of course that's what I'm trying to do. And well, we'll see what the future brings. Well, let's go to the next one. The ecosystem here. Well, it's fun to hand paint it, but nowadays I usually tend to place the forests and foliage and all the green stuff directly on the terrain. Let's deactivate this one. Let's go right to the ships. Well, the ships again are very small in the scene. You can actually only see them by the light sources I placed on them. These are created similarly to the building, throwing stuff together and trying to create a shape that sorta kinda looks like a ship. But let's try to get a closer look at one of them. Let's switch the camera here and let's see. Alright, wrong button. Alright, now we are closer to one of the smaller ships. It is a rather abstract design, and it's nothing too amazing since it's only a very small background detail. So let's make a render of it so you can see how it actually looks. Alright, here we have a render of the actual ship with very bright highlights. So let's tone it down a little bit so we can see a little bit more. Alright, so as you can see, a lot of elements thrown together just to kinda sorta make it look like a spaceship or transport shape. Well, that's something I constantly go back to, using these small ships with other projects and modify them to make them look a little different, and use them in, like I said, other projects. And that helps to save some time, especially when it comes to background detail. No one will actually really notice. So it's quick, it's efficient, and something I can suggest everyone to do for background details. Don't go into too much useless detail no one will ever see. So yeah, in this scene there are a bunch of these and a bunch of other transports, just to suggest that there is business going on around these towers and that there is some kind of life happening there, so that it all doesn't look too artificial. I mean, the scene itself honestly looks artificial, but elements like small ships zipping around and birds and stuff can make a scene easily come to life and look a little more, or lets it all look a little less artificial. So that's the small ships in the scene. Let's deactivate them too and go to the foreground elements. And that's something I do constantly. Normally my foreground elements, let's switch back to the actual camera. Normally my foreground elements are created separately in a separate view scene file as well. But for this scene, I think, if memory serves, I did it all within the big scene. So yeah, for the foreground, you of course want to use objects that are a little higher detailed, so it works up front. And well, let's take a quick look and render this one so we can see how this looks. Of course, normally when working on something in an artistic way, you want to have elements that frame the scene. So the tree is added here on the left and right, and the additional elements do add a frame that frame the overall hero objects, like the hero building that we can't see here. So let's do a quick render. So yeah, now we can see how the trees and the silhouettes do kind of work as a frame for our hero building and the building here in the back. The overall depth works really nice with also the shadowy area here that suggests another kind of framing device for our hero building. So the foreground elements I usually do rather late in the overall process, setting up the scene and view. So I have the hero elements already placed and the overall scene finished, so I exactly know where to put the framing objects so I don't block view of the actual objects in the scene that I actually want the viewer to see. So it's not an easy thing to do, keeping the balance right, but it's something I would suggest everyone to keep in mind, that if you want to do something artistically, you have to kind of keep in mind the framing of the overall image, and that you draw the eye to the areas you want the viewer to see. And I think it works pretty good, even though this big element down here doesn't really work, and that's something I fixed in Photoshop with additional renderings, and that leads me to the next part of this little walkthrough, and that's the Photoshop part, where we will discuss how the different elements were rendered and stitched together. So let's skip right ahead into Photoshop. So before we jump into Photoshop, I want to show you guys a technique I am constantly using when creating my work, and that's the multi-pass options from within View that will help you to render out masks for all kinds of objects in your scene, and makes it much easier to implement them into already established projects or pictures just by placing them in your scene and applying the masks, and you don't have to cut out all the objects by hand, which saves, of course, a large amount of time. So what you can do in View is to go into the render options, enable multipass, edit, and there you can go into object masks. That allows you to practically select every single object in your scene, so you can render out very specific masks for very specific objects, or groups. Same goes for the layers. If you have a large group of objects you want to have a combined mask for. The same goes, of course, for the ecosystems and the trees, and of course even materials. You can render out masks for special materials in your scene, so you have literally unlimited depth when it comes to detailed, or when it comes to prepare your overall scene for Photoshop. Even a cloud mask is in here for your volumetric clouds. I can only recommend using this as much as possible, since of course saves a lot of time. You also have various extra layers that will enable you to modify and manipulate certain elements in your scene in Photoshop, bumping up highlights or shadows and all kinds of different things, or create special masks for certain lighting conditions, and so on and so on. So much stuff you can do here. Yeah, that's the view part that is very important to my process. Since, like I mentioned earlier, I tend to go back to view a lot while already working in Photoshop to render out additional objects, to fill up the scene a little bit. Or if something doesn't work, I try to rework certain elements in the scene and render out new plates to incorporate into the scene in Photoshop. So much for this. Let's go into Photoshop. Close this one. Alright, now we're in Photoshop, and what you can see here is the first and original plate I rendered for this scene. As you can see, it's only the mountains and the forest, but something we haven't seen before is the water element that came in, much like I explained earlier with the mountain on the left here. So it looks like a river is going down here, and it also serves well as an element to read the image, that leads the eye a little bit, and in the end is a valuable element to the overall scene. Now let's take a look at the layers here. As you can see, there's a lot of stuff going on with folders and all kinds of layers, and of course the masks I just explained a few seconds ago. Let's select one for the terrain. All the stuff you can see here that's left out, that's basically the forest elements. Here the water elements. All these masks help you to select all these different elements and allow you to quickly, I don't know, paint over and manipulate the overall appearance of certain things. And that's of course very helpful to, especially when it comes to matte painting stuff, to adjust lighting and atmosphere. Now down here in the layers we have all the different, I call it filters, that help you to adjust very specific elements. The indirect lighting helps you to make everything a little bit brighter and adds detail into the shadowy areas. Then we have the reflections, of course, that will boost your water or reflective materials in the scene. The shadows explain themselves, basically, help you to add more detail throughout the scene. But as you can see, it's a very strong filter layer, so you have to be really careful when applying that one. The diffuse, again, something to brighten up your elements, to add more detail in darker areas, and so on. You have also a Z-depth layer if you want to apply a blur effect, a lens blur effect with different blur layers to it. Let's try it. First we select the color range. So we have some great values. Then there are multiple techniques for this, but let's try this one. Disable this one and go into blur and lens blur. There we can select the layer mask, and as you already can see, the background gets blurred out when we click up here. Everything gets sharp here. If we invert this and push this up a little bit, you can see how this area is getting very blurry while the background area or the midground area tends to be sharp. That's of course defined by the radius. Depending on where you click, you practically define where the scene gets blurry, and if we click back here, we see that the foreground gets sharp again. It's a really nice tool that not only works for this blur technique, it can also be used to enhance certain atmosphere effects that you specifically only want to go into the deeper elements of the scene. So that's something really interesting to play with. But let's go back here. So yeah, there are a lot of different elements you can render out with Vue, but like I said in the Vue part of the walkthrough, depending on how many layers you select to be rendered, your RAM can be very quickly filled up, and Vue then unfortunately tends to crash rather often instead of warning you about things that will probably not work so well. So yeah, that's the elements you can render out with Vue, as well as the channels or the masks up here. Let's have a look at how this picture comes together. So of course down here we have the color layer. That's basically the plate for it all. Additionally, I have cut out some of the treetops for some small little light glimpses down there. If you see that quickly, it's not much, but it's a small detail that brings in a little more variation to the overall lighting. Next is a shadow layer that doesn't make much sense now, but it works later when the buildings are in there. Next one is a folder that contains a render try for the background building that I dismissed. For some reason I can't exactly explain right now, since, like I said, this picture is from 2010, and this is a little bit of a time travel for me as well with this with this Photoshop file. The next one is the actual background building I placed in the scene, and there's not much in there except basically the background building. And for that, I think I have the actual render plate here. As you can see, I didn't render the complete scene for this element. In Vue, you have the option to render out areas, and for this background building, I basically selected the area around that particular building and only rendered this background element for the final big picture. And of course, I did render out all the different filter elements. So who knows what's handy in the process and what isn't. So it's good to have all that. Just if you want to play or adjust very specific elements to make this building sit well in the scene or integrate well into the scene. The next one is another folder, and as you can see, a lot of folders in here, since most of these elements are a combination of various layers and all kinds of manipulations to integrate it all well into the scene. And this is another background building that came also rather late in the process creating this scene, since somehow this site felt a little empty. And like I said in the view part for the far background building, there's always room to add something, as long as you not overdo it. So there's still some breathing room when it comes to the overall composition. The next one is basically, if I recognize this right, it's basically a copy. This one is basically a copy of this one, just moved over here. So it's basically building a framing device along with these two background buildings for the big tower, and that's this one. This is our hero tower, and the one that we want to lead our eye to, or the viewer's eye to. So the two background buildings right there serve perfectly as a framing for this bigger one. Before I added this version of the hero tower, I had another one that, as you can see, is much closer to the camera, and it for some reason, or not for some reason, it just doesn't work. It's too big, it's too prominent, and I don't know, it didn't bring in the depth I wanted in the scene. And so I left this one out and decided to make it a little smaller and twist it a little bit, so we get a little better view at the front of the object. Let's take a look into the folder of the hero tower. Oh, look here, we have a texture where I try to apply some textures. What's this? This is this is a shadow layer, and like I mentioned earlier, you can easily overdo the shadow part with the shadow filter. So you have to be really careful not to make it too black, since as you can see here, 5% opacity, that's really enough for this one. And if we turn it off, you don't see a big difference, but when we go into the picture a little deeper, you can see that there is some small detail added that will help the overall impression for this building, and adds some neat detail to it all. Additional, we have some lights on the building, even though we are in daylight. But since we are looking at the shadow part, or the part of the building that lies in the shadow, I decided to add some small lights there. Then we have additional filters applied to this building. Most prominently, some highlight filters, as you can see in this part. If we deactivate this specular blur, this adds a little bit of a more, I don't know how to explain it, a more photographic effect when it comes to light, and how it bounces off of surrounding elements and all this stuff. There is another bottom glow that I deactivated. A lot of very, very subtle additional detail, as you can see. All these elements are set mostly to screen and have a lowered opacity to not look too forced on the building, so it all looks kind of organic and integrates as good as possible. So yeah, that's the hero building, and all this stuff can be applied or is applied to basically every one of these buildings in this scene. Let's zoom out and let's see how it looks when we disable this mask. Okay, so you can see that down here is something, and masks are really vital to all this process, since they allow you to always go back and adjust things. So I can only recommend, if you have a machine, a PC or whatever that supports working with larger files, then try to work as non-destructive as possible, and that's what these masks are for. They allow you to constantly go back and to adjust things. You never know how a picture develops, and if certain elements block other elements, or if you want to have details back. These masks allow you to go back and add and remove stuff depending on how your project develops. So that's the hero tower, and let's have a look at the plate for this one. Is it actually this one? No, that's not this one, but that's the big one, I think. Yeah, that's the big one I decided not to leave in the scene. As you can see, I rendered this one with active water, so I can use the reflections for this water part in the big scene. So you have to keep all these things in mind when rendering your elements, so you can save time and not have to render it twice, since you forgot, oh, there's water, I need the reflection of this building since it's missing, etc., etc. So that's stuff you have to keep in mind. So let's take a quick look at the other elements. The background buildings. These are all the rendered plates for the background building, and this is our final hero building. As you can see in the layers, again, a lot of filters rendered, as well as the water. So we have the reflection of this tower here. All this stuff is used, like I just explained in the scene file. These filters are all used in bringing it all together and sit well in the scene. So that brings us back to the additional shadow layer here. Since the sun comes from the top right and goes down to the left, we of course need some kind of shadow in this area, and to not make it look wrong, since a lot of elements are already in the scene, I had to place it down here so it's not blocked by other elements. And now activated, you can see that it adds a very important element of atmosphere in this area. Now deactivate it again. It looks far too bright. It kind of works, but I think adding this shadow area makes it work a little better, and looks far more realistic for the overall impression of this hero building. So next we have this water smoother layer. That's basically, well, let's zoom in. If we deactivate this smoother layer, you can see that there's a little bit of pixelation going on. So what I did is use the water mask and cut out this water element from the original plate, and ran a blur filter over it. I think it was the motion blur, to smooth it out a little bit and it looks much better this way and not so hard because of the rendered pixelation that's unfortunately in the scene. Next one is a paint layer, and as you can see, there is not much painted in this scene, except for areas on the water, and that's adding some waves and some foam to the coastline here. We deactivate it and reactivate it. There's also some painting on the island over here to add some more highlights to define the rocks and the overall look of this island a little more, so it doesn't look too boring, since when we deactivate it there is not much going on here. So it looks much more, well, dramatic, maybe the wrong word, but it adds detail and looks more exciting. Realism is important, but sometimes you can play a little bit with, well, let's call it artistic freedom in this case. The next folder is the textures folder, and here we have a little more going on. Let's deactivate it again and activate it again. There's a lot of stuff going on the mountain hangs and here in front, and as you can see here, I didn't fix the hard edge of the layer since it's later blocked by the foreground elements. So again, it's the technique of only do what needs to be done. I often have problems to follow, since I don't know, I'm a perfectionist in some things and constantly do stuff that will eventually be blocked by other parts. But anyway, let's zoom in here a little bit to take a look at the textures. It's basically just a rock texture and some green stuff to suggest detail in the areas that look rather dark here and don't look too exciting. So we now have a kind of a rock structure with a lot of green and moss and whatever grasses and you name it. Let's deactivate this mask, and you can see this is the texture for this part. And when we go back again, it sits in the scene very well and manages to integrate this hill over here much better than without this texture. I mean, it works, but there's always stuff you can do to enhance the overall look. When it comes to this particular area up here, the texture doesn't completely work, but it sort of kind of adds some rock elements. And since, again, this area is later blocked by foreground elements, it's not too important to work on that part. Now, if we look here, we have, again, mountain textures added that will give it all a little more depth and detail, and the closer we go, you can see the photo quality drops, or the texture quality drops, but it still works in the overall picture, and that's something to keep in mind as well. It's not always important to have it all super detailed out. Most of the time you can add textures that don't match the quality of the actual render, but it still works. And if you're careful with where you apply your textures in Photoshop and how you apply them, it can completely work with textures that don't match the overall quality of your render. Of course, the render is pixel perfect, a 3D render, and the texture comes from a camera that, well, at least nowadays isn't able to capture every tree and you name it, really pixel perfect, and that's perfectly fine. So these are the textures for this image. The next one is the ships folder, and that's something I explained in the view part. These ships really help to sell that there is life going on in this scene. Stuff is happening. Ships are there to I don't know, transport people or to dock on this tower to deliver stuff and whatever. I even painted in some towers, I think is the word, to connect the ship docked to one of these towers, and it looks cool, but there's the perfectionist in me again. It's a detail probably no one will ever see, except you are buying a larger print of this picture. Excuse me. So yeah, these are the spaceships, and as you can see, there's a lot of stuff going on in the layer folder as well. All the ships are basically rendered on a separate plate, so I can again have freedom to place the ships basically wherever I want, and that of course helps to construct the overall scene with a little more freedom. Now these two guys down here are a little special since I placed them over the water. So let's find these guys in this mess. Alright, it's these two. So looking at this, I may have a problem with the flares here since they are in the wrong folder for the wrong fighter. But anyway, let's take a look into it. Here we have the flares, along with a reflection down here. And as you can see, very subtle and small. There's also a path that's created by these ships zipping over the water surface. So there is a lot of small detail in there, and no one, unfortunately, will ever catch. But it's fun to put it in there just to round it up and to make it all, I don't know, sit better in the scene and to integrate a little better. You never know when you look at the picture, at the full picture. It's sometimes very subtle details that make objects sit in the scene better. So you never know what even the smallest detail is good for, but it all depends on what you're planning with your project. So the next scene, the next layer folder contains the foreground elements, and in view I had an element here on the left where I said that it doesn't look too good, and as you can see here, I modified that element and placed elements around this object or in front of that object to make it all look a little better. And since this here we have it, since this one the way it is here is much too prominent and distracts from the overall image. So this is the plate for the foreground foliage elements and the tree. As you can see here, as well as with the other rendered plates, we have all the filter elements here as well, just in case we need to modify very specific elements. I could seriously clean up some of these files since there are a lot of black layers in here that contain absolutely no detail. Anyway, so that's the plate for the front elements, and there is a second plate where I try to hide this very disturbing, or not disturbing, but this element that doesn't really work on the left bottom side. So that's this part down here. I also added, well, let's take a look into the folder. I also added a lot of textures to that part. If you take a look here, especially the tree, added a more defined bark element to make it look a little more realistic, since when we take a closer look, it doesn't really look realistic. There's a lot of hard edges and hard lines going on that I try to overpaint over here to hide the hard lines a little bit, and to add a little variation to the overall object here. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on in all of the elements in this picture. Here we have a painted shadow layer to frame this area down here in the picture a little bit, to integrate it all a little better. We have also a lot of adjustment layers in this part of the scene to brighten up or darken certain elements. Again, everything done for integration. Especially when deactivating these curves, this green here is so bright that it's almost too yellowish. So I added these curves to tone it down a little bit. And as you can see, it's again very subtle and not overdone. This color balance part here, for example, when you take a look at this part, when we deactivate it, it's, I don't know, it's a little bland. It works, it definitely works, but it's a little bland. So when we activate it, I added a little bit of a greenish glow that looks a little bit better, since all the green elements down here create a kind of bouncing light effect that bounces off of all the different surfaces. So this green helps to integrate it a little better. Again, you have to be very careful how to apply stuff like that. That's the foreground elements, and now's the stuff that really brings the picture together, and that's the overall atmosphere. Now the picture will drastically change when I activate this layer right now. So this is very close to the final image, and let's deconstruct the atmosphere here a little bit. Deactivating the flares, another fix, another flare, and yeah, that's something I like to do. It's a lot of fun. I added some sparkles, sparkle effect down here that could be some strange, I don't know, alien insects or something, or something the plants give out or give up into the air. So that's a fun element, and that's split up into left and right, again to have the most possible freedom not to overdo these elements. Then we have the element of dirt, and as we can see, this camera here is placed basically in the green nature part of this world. So well, let's say it could be a webcam of sorts, like we have on Earth so many webcams nowadays. So if they are not constantly checked, there's dirt that lands on the lens and kind of creates, I don't know, some blurry areas. And for this particular picture, this lens dirt helps to give it a more realistic, really matte painting kind of look, especially optical effects like lens dirt or lens flares. Especially, you have to be careful with lens flares. These things can add a lot of realism to your scene. Yeah, this one is another framing layer that helps to it's basically just painting a darker color at the edges of the scene to frame the overall picture a little bit better. And then we come again into adjustment layers that I love to play around with, to be honest. To play with colors, adjust colors, and all kinds of things to make the picture look the way you intended. Right here, that's interesting. This curves layer contains the Z-depth mask I earlier applied when explaining the blur effect. So this stuff helps you to, like I mentioned earlier, to apply certain color effects for atmospheric effects. So certain colors only appear in the background of the scene. And that's what these Z-depth layers can be used for. As you can see, when I turn on, turn off, turn on, most of the color changes happen in the midground and in the background, not so much in the foreground. So yeah, this Z-depth element can help you to select very specific areas of your image to apply certain color filters. Same goes for this this color balance layer, where I also used the Z-depth filter, but this time more for the foreground elements to give it a more golden appearance, golden shine effect. So these are the adjustment layers of the atmosphere. Next one is a glow element that goes to the building in the back here. We deactivate it and activate it. You have to keep in mind that these buildings are hit by the sun practically directly, and it's not a wrong thing, especially when working on a scene that has a very hazy atmosphere and foggy. You can add some glow to parts of the scene that you know are hit by the sun directly, and that will add another layer to the overall atmosphere effect of the scene. And here we have the practically the hero glow layer of the scene. So again, its purpose is to define the atmosphere a little bit and to add glow even to foreground elements. You could say that it's a little bit overdone, and I would actually agree, but there is nothing in this picture that's actually intended to look completely realistic, and I think that would be boring. So the most effective pictures, especially when it comes to sci-fi, in some cases are the ones that over stylize a little bit. So let's deactivate these glow layers and go into the sunbeams. Well, this element is created with a filter called Luce, and that's Luce. I think when you Google it, you will probably find something about it. This is a very interesting filter that helps you to create sunbeams, and again, if used with caution, it can add another layer to your overall atmosphere and help to integrate it much better. So yeah, last but not least, the lens flares, the lens dirt layer I just explained, and the lens flare layers are created in After Effects with a plugin called optical effects. Well, optical effects is actually wrong. It's optical flares. It's a plugin by Video Copilot, and I created some plates with After Effects that I constantly go back to for my projects to add lens flares to the overall scene. Again, you have to be really careful not to overdo it, since it can be an element that really disturbs the flow of how to read an image. So again, very careful use when it comes to these lens flares. Next we have a fix layer. That's something I constantly do as well, is when the picture actually is done and something isn't looking completely right yet, I tend to go in and fix some additional stuff. And here we have an additional water reflection for this part of the scene. Let's deactivate it and activate it. So it makes it all look a little more. It gives a little more variation to the overall water, and I think it works. It works. Next one is something I talked about in the view segment as well, is birds. And adding birds can help to add life to your scene and to make it look less artificial. So we have some here, we have some here. Yeah, it's birds from our planet, and we are not really on our planet in this scene, but it doesn't matter too much, since you just want to convey the feel of the fact that there is life on in this place. And next one is the final image. Now here again some things have changed, and the first thing you will notice is that the image is mirrored or flipped horizontally, and that's done because I found that the picture reads much better this way, and that's because normally, at least in the Western world, we read from left to right, and the picture now starts, instead of the right side, it starts at the top left and immediately leads down to our hero building, and this one leads to this tower and leads to the other tower back here and to the background. You can also follow this tree line down here to the water, and the water then leads to the tower, and that I found works much better than the original. When we deactivate this final layer, you will also notice that the lighting and the atmosphere colors have changed a little bit. And that's because I usually, as a final step in the overall process that I will not show too much here, I go to Adobe Lightroom and import the final image there, to create final color adjustments in Lightroom. So there I managed to bring in additional color variation in this area. Overall, the sun glow, while it really is pretty dominant and almost blocks the mountain here, it does work, and it gives a little breathing room and space to make the hero tower here work a little better. And the overall colors of the green and the shadows and the water and everything sits well, sits much better with the overall impression I wanted the viewer to have. So this is the final version, and I'm fairly happy with this one. And yeah, going back to the explanation why I don't make a tutorial for this one, or for a picture, any picture. This process overall is rather complex, and I got requests by magazines to create a scene for a tutorial, but they have limited space, and explaining a scene from beginning to end would explode that space and their limitations. So that's just not really possible. I did write a couple of tutorials for magazines like Advanced Photoshop, but these were more limited to explaining specific techniques within a given project, instead of explaining a complete project from start to finish. So this basically concludes the Photoshop part, and I hope you managed to learn some stuff from this segment as well as the view segment. Alright, so this concludes our little excursion into how to or how I created this specific image. We have gotten through View, where we learned a lot of stuff about how to set up a scene like this one. Then we took a turn into Photoshop and took a look at how to combine all the different elements we rendered out with View, and how to push the renders and the overall atmosphere and the lighting and the depth of the image to really have something outstanding that a lot of people will react to and give positive feedback. And that's something I hope to get from this video as well. If you have feedback, I'm more than willing to listen to what you have to say. And I want to take this chance to apologize for my English. I don't have too much English speaking experience, as well as my microphone. I don't have a super mega cool high-end equipment microphone here, and I hope it all worked out well. And I hope you had some fun, learned a lot of stuff, and maybe you got something out of this that will help you to create your own scenes, worlds, and push it to the next level. I wish you a wonderful day and hope to see you next time.